The pandemic turned remote work from a luxury to a norm. With social distancing and lockdown measures, millions of workers worldwide found themselves forced to work from home. It used to be just a fancy benefit reserved for some, but now employers realize remote work is feasible and even beneficial for many jobs and industries.
Companies had to adapt to the new normal almost overnight, leading to the expansion of new technologies like video conferencing
Zoom.
and cloud-based collaboration tools.
What tools?
Collaboration. But working from home also comes with its own set of challenges, like juggling work and home life and feeling isolated. That's a big one. We'll talk about that. The pandemic has transformed remote work into a mainstream approach, but we'll have to wait and see if it's here to stay or if traditional office-based work will return once things settle down. In fact, it sounds like we were reading this a year ago. Many of you will have seen the headlines, like big companies increasingly are saying, no, people are going to come back to work. I remember there was one with Amazon recently where it's like the head of HR said categorically, no, people are coming back.
But it's interesting because you've also seen companies like Airbnb being like, we are embracing remote and now it's sort of fully here to stay.
We'll talk about this, but marketplace dynamics.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to the Morality of Everyday Things. I'm Ant.
I'm Jake.
We are your co-hosts, longtime friends, business partners. We met nearly a decade ago. Wow.
Yeah.
In fact, wait, what year is it?
2020.
What year is it, Marty?
Over a decade ago.
What's his name, Marty?
We're
Reply.
into our 11th year.
Wow, look at that. We've been running this for a few years. Please, if you're a long-time listener, do leave a review on Spotify, Apple. Also leave your feedback. Maybe we'll check in the review form, but we've got a lot of good feedback from people recently. Let's go straight into it.
Oh, and also welcome. By now, we're probably well into our new season format.
Oh, yes.
This is going to be like the third.
Hello from the past.
This is into the new season. Tell us if you like it. We're going to try and be as regular as possible, sticking to the Monday release schedule.
Like someone who eats a lot of fiber.
Yeah.
Regular
Actually, in all the good ways.
Exactly. Another thing we might do is we might set up a chat for listeners, like maybe a Discord or a Slack or something. But yeah, keep your eyes peeled.
On to the show. So let's start, as always, with definitions. There's not a lot that's really important to define, but I suppose one distinction worth making is let's look at working from home and working remote. And to be fair, sometimes they're synonymous. If you are remote from where the company is headquartered, but working from your home, I guess that's the same thing.
Yeah, so I think one thing to clarify is that there's a little bit of overlap here. What we're going to be talking about, I think, is more work from home than remote. Basically, remote is that you cannot commute into the office.
Yeah.
Technically, all remote work is work from home,
I suppose. Yeah.
Actually, to be fair, it's not necessarily, right? So work from home is working from your home. You could remote work and still go to a co-working space, just not with your coworkers.
Yeah.
But the main distinction is remote work is you are working from a place you can't commute to your work. And often people tend to use it to mean like quite distant, like another country, another time zone, right?
Yeah.
So like technically we have a guy in our company who works in the north of England, but we don't really think of him as remote in the same sense as the people who work from, say, for example, Greece. Because
it's funny.
He obviously doesn't come every day, but he can much more easily jump onto a train with a day's notice.
That's it. He'll come down maybe every 1 or 2 months and visit us, and we'll work together, go for drinks together,
and it would be totally reasonable to ask him to come every 2 weeks. We just happen to choose not to. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas a truly remote person, is more remote.
Whereas the guys that we have who work in Chile are
truly remote.
Yeah.
Now the work from home, I think a big part of that is, and you'll hear why we're making this distinction when we come to the later bits, is working from your home.
Your actual house.
It's actually working from the place where you live. Is there anything else more to clarify on that?
No, I think that's the key thing. And I mean, the pandemic initially just it was what you'd call in economics an exogenous shock. It just sort of happened, and then suddenly people had to deal with it. And I think a lot of people weren't necessarily well equipped to deal with working from home. And now they probably are more so if they're choosing to do it regularly. But you generally, unless you've built a nice home office, you maybe lack some of the comforts provided by an office. Not necessarily. That's the point. People have kind of adapted to that.
So maybe you're listening to this now and you're thinking, hey, Morality Podcast, why are you talking to me about work from home? Maybe you're working from home listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
Stop it. Get back on Slack. But yeah, you might be wondering why we're taking a moral perspective on this. First of all, this isn't necessarily fully moral. Like, we will also just kind of talk a little bit personal perspective, policy, and bear in mind our biases that we're employers, but we're also employers who are people, so we enjoy a lot of the benefits as well. Like, we're not like, the corporate executives who are like, people need to be in, but also like they, do whatever we want. So just to clarify that.
It's definitely worth highlighting that bias up front because this is probably context if you've followed the podcast for a while, but in case you don't, Ant and I are the co-founders of a company called Stasher, which is a luggage storage platform. We now have a team of 14 people, including the two of us. And as you've picked up already, they're distributed widely across the world. So although half the team is based with easy access to London, the other half are scattered everywhere from Chile to Greece to Egypt to Newcastle.
To be fair, you use the word scattered. We need someone in Australia just to make to make a little triangle.
Set.
But yeah, so the moral perspective actually that we'll talk a bit about is, I think it's funny. This is more, the reason we're talking about this is because something we've discussed personally. The place of work and meaning in your life, or the relationship between work and meaning in your life. And that will kind of inform a little bit around this.
It's a worthwhile reference to actually, if you haven't sort of listened to the series all the way through, we did an episode fairly recently on work and meaning. And I think
Yeah.
this follows quite neatly on from that. And if you haven't listened to it, it's worth going back to check that, because Ant's right. It's not necessarily that there's a real moral question at stake here, but it's almost more the theme of living your best life, morality in the sense of, your values.
What should you do?
What should you do
Yeah.
without it necessarily being a sort of case of murder or,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
So to follow that, what is our personal perspectives? So I think it's interesting. I've kind of matured, changed my view, or not.
I don't think you've matured.
No, I haven't matured.
That was a lie.
And I haven't even changed, because changed implies like going from one to the other. I've developed my opinion in this over time. And so I'll tell you a little bit about our work policy, and then we'll go from there. One, half the team is remote, right? Generally, when we are hiring for a new role, the first question we have is this role going to be remote or not, right? And that's for a few reasons. The main thing is that, one, a lot of roles are better suited to working remote. Like whether that's working from your home or going to a co-working space, we'll come to some of that later, is a separate point, but some of them are better suited to remote or not. So that could be for reasons of purchasing power parity. So maybe you could get an equivalently good person for a very meaningful discount in another geography. A lot of people do that by hiring in Lisbon or South America or places like that.
It's worth saying here that we're headquartered in London. So we founded the company in London. We're based here. That's where the office is. And London is famously one of the more expensive places that you can work and have an office. And even more so than London, companies based in Silicon Valley in America and other parts of the world like that have certainly seen this benefit.
It's a funny thing because it can be a benefit the company, which ultimately is a benefit for everyone who works there, because it makes the company more able to survive, and also means that we can redistribute wealth around the world, right? Which I'm not saying, like, oh, we're saving, because you tend to hire high school people. I think the interesting thing about this remote working stuff is it tends to work only at the extremes.
What do you mean by that?
So it best suits either the most skilled work or the least skilled work. The reason that's the case is because communication is hard. So it only makes sense for the most skilled or least skilled because the least skilled work is the easiest to communicate remotely. And also the minimum pay, you start to also approach like minimum payment issues, right? Like the minimum you're going to pay anyone reasonably in the UK or US is much, much, much higher than a very livable wage somewhere like the Philippines and stuff. And to clarify,
because of purchasing power parity.
Exactly. And to clarify, we don't go to these places and then gyp people. We pay them very good salaries by local standards. So it's a real win-win. Like they get good salaries by local standards. In fact, one of our sort of employees, they're a long-term employee through someone who manages our customer support. Actually, I remember there was a little celebration in the team Slack because they bought a house. And everyone in London was like, what the hell? we can't buy houses. And they posted like a thank you very much because this helps support me do this. And we're like, of course, you do good work. You deserve it. So on the low skill stuff, it's easier to communicate, right? And then on the high skill stuff, I'm particularly thinking about developers and certain senior roles. One, you tend to be more used to diffuse communication anyway. So developers, you'll probably all meet in stand-ups and stuff anyway. And, more senior executives, they'll probably do their catch-ups and stuff. They might be remote anyway, more used to it and tend to be better communicators at that point. But the other thing is that the relative cost saving becomes a much, much bigger benefit. And then you have these people in the middle where actually the value of being able to communicate well, and those people in the middle tend to be the people who, you want to train more. That's where it's the sweet spot where it's like, oh, we really want to be together in person because there is a real value to being able, I know that you'll have a strong opinion on this, but being able to communicate and be in the same place is, if you've ever tried to explain something to someone over a video call, you will immediately understand. Like the ability to just say, just come here and look at my screen. We'll point with hands and we'll go to a whiteboard so we can draw things together and stuff. And I know there's tools for this, but it's a bit like writing with pen and pencil and paper, right? Like obviously alternatives exist, but none of them are quite as easy just yet. Like maybe when Zuckerberg does the metaverse, but that's one part of my perspective. That's our rough policy. Oh, I never said what our actual policy is.
Yeah. I can fill that in really quickly, but I was just going to counterpoint one of your things. I don't know that it necessarily. I totally agree with the sort of skill thing, although I don't think it necessarily is skill that sort of dictates that. Because for example, it's more just opportunity, right? It's just kind of.
Yeah, it depends. So, for example, a mid-level developer could make more sense to be remote than a senior-level salesperson, right? Yeah. Because it depends a bit on the nature of the communication need with that person and stuff. And also how much of their work is going to be isolated, which, particularly for developers, that tends to be the case.
This is it. I was going to say it's not necessarily the skill level. It's more the role itself. And that development, I've noticed, lends itself well to remote work because of the nature of the work is like you have a lot of deep focus time.
And even it's relatively siloed.
Yeah. And even before COVID, I remember the people we had the biggest trouble persuading to come into the office
were developers.
were always the developers.
And actually, I just used the word siloed. Siloed is not even true. Like developers are very collaborative. It's just that they are so used to doing that remotely anely anyway.
Yeah, you bring them into the office and they spend a lot of time headphones in, just kind of trying to not be distracted anyway. So
Exactly.
there's a certain amount of that lends itself. But equally, like you said, I mean, there are customer support roles where actually being in the office again isn't necessarily beneficial. There's a lot of aspects of every role. I mean,
Yep.
the one aspect of my role I find that benefits from work from home is just where you have periods
Focus
of deep
time.
work. But then the flip side is a lot of my role is management, and that's actually made much harder.
Dealing
by-
with people, talking to people is much harder
And,
remotely.
and I feel like this is a real theme across people's perspectives. Is just like anyone in a management role, I think, generally finds it harder being remote. Whereas there are
Well, actually, ironically, statistically, a lot of the people who like work from home and stuff, we have the bias that we're young, so we think about young people. But empirically, a lot of the people who like it are older people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the issue is that younger people need the older people to come in and teach them.
Yeah. That's
Right.
a really important.
At least that's I don't know statistically whether that is that frequent, but that's the thing I read in as an AI that's roughly taking in data. That's I suppose an HI, human intelligence. You see that and it's like, oh, this seems to be a problem that comes up, people mention. So one thing on our policy, we intentionally hire, is this remote or not? And then the people that we have who do work with us have a mix of work from home and also have the option to do remote stints. The majority of the people who work here, it's a small sample size, but the majority of the people do choose to work from home the 2 days a week that we offer as standard. And, people also haven't, asked, like, can I do more or less, depending on, like, if they have a long commute. At least us and then a couple other people, there's only 6 or 7 of us in the London office, will come in pretty much every day. We just prefer to. And quite a few people who are remote, as in, like, will be based in Europe or something like that, choose to come and be at the office, like, a week or two every month or two.
I was just going to add to that. It's interesting because the work from home thing does then have a distinction from the work remote, because working from home when you have access to the office, it's a different kind of benefit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like remote work, you basically, as employers, we benefit from the cost savings, but obviously as an employee, you benefit from access to like a London company working remotely with all the comforts of like not having to move and everything else. So it opens up a lot of opportunities.
There's other stuff though. This is both for remote and work from home. It's the opportunity to have a job without direct monitoring.
Yeah. And I wonder actually what the benefits of working from home largely seem to be. We'll get into all the pros and cons, but it does largely seem to be just like saving time on commuting and the kind of home comforts of working from home. So we'll get into that in more detail.
Yep. One thing quickly on perspective. So we said how we would relate this to meaning. It's funny. I do remote working stints. You'll remember I was away for episodes within the last few months
when the sound recording quality
was bad.
a little bit more questionable.
Ironically, I think the best way I realized for future is just to record it on my phone.
Really?
When I send you WhatsApp messages or something, or like when I record stuff on my phone to append to the front of episodes, it's actually fine quality.
Yeah, it's not.
So I just should record it like that in future.
Maybe it's relative because maybe it was me sounding delightful.
No, it can't be
on
that.
this microphone.
But sorry. So the place of meaning. I think the interesting thing is you'll have heard, or some people may have heard, there's an epidemic of loneliness, right? And I think it's so interesting. I used the analogy in an episode recently, I believe the Roald Dahl episode, of fast food. And my feeling is that there's a place for work from home, but I feel like too much of it, in the same way there's a place for fast food, but I feel like too much of it might hurt in a way that we don't yet understand. And a big part of that is just feeling disconnected. So that's like literally like if you're not going out and just interacting with people. It was a thing at a more extreme scale we all understood and experienced during COVID. But then the other thing I'd say is that, and this is a part of that maybe evolves as I kind of meet people who are at different stages in their life. And granted, I'm also biased because I run the company that we work for, so I have strong feelings about it. I guess part of the question is, should work be a source of your meaning in life? And I want to say, I hope that as many people as possible can say yes to that. It's a great way to be happy. But I kind of understand as well how the older I get, my brother's thinking of having kids. He's not particularly motivated by his work. And, I can kind of see where people find meaning from other places. But then you also kind of get the cynical employer perspective where it's like, well, if people are doing this because they want to clock off and don't really care, then it starts to kind of have this strange imbalance or strange balancing act you're trying to piece together there. Do you understand what I mean by that?
I do. I also largely agree with it, I think. But maybe it's a case of sort of ideals versus practice. But I'm with you, obviously, on the fact that I think in an ideal life, work forms a really important part of your meaning.
Yeah.
Not
the only part?
Yeah, not
but
the
an
only
important part.
I totally get that that's not the case for a lot of people. And I think, therefore, maybe we have to acknowledge our bias that it is for us because we run a company that we created. And therefore, there's creative meaning in that and there's purpose. And eventually, maybe financial meaning.
I would also say, just one thing to bear in mind is that, you're saying that about our specific situation. I want to clarify that circle that we're drawing is not around founders or whatever. There are plenty of people, probably the likelihood is if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably within the people who has the ability to find a job that you find, fulfilling, right?
Yeah.
I think when you're saying that, I'm assuming your intention is more to draw the line where like there's a lot of people who have little choice but to do work that is,
that's it.
Really hard to find.
I mean, there are jobs that are just jobs, and there are jobs that
and there's nothing wrong
for
with
the
that.
sake of,
I need money.
Exactly. Whereas,
and actually, there's also people who find those jobs fulfilling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true too. Therefore, I kind of just wanted to acknowledge that it's maybe a little bit like, I don't want to come off overly idealistic by saying it's
Everyone
important that
should
work
do, yeah.
should be a source of meaning. However, I would hope in the jobs that we've created that not just us, but our team find their jobs fun, challenging, and meaningful. I hope they enjoy being part of creating something. You guys, if you're
Yeah.
listening.
No, but I mean, even then, like, it's not like anyone's at risk of losing their job or something with us, because different people have different approaches, and that's okay. We try to create a place that fosters
Yeah.
that, but it's more that it's a spectrum, right, as opposed to whether it's binary or not.
Mhm.
And I'd hope for people's own sake. I think a big part of your meaning in life should be related to the thing that you're spending most of your working hours doing, right?
Yeah. And then I think without getting too anthropological about it, if you look at the history of work, a large part of it's about people physically coming together to produce things, to create things, to work on things. And I think people...
It's a great way to create a sense of community and meaning.
Yeah, and community is a really important word there, because I think that's something that people have a real genuine need for, and we'll talk about the sort of isolation effect of work from home in a second. But that's something that I think is a powerful force. And even if you're part of a community with people that we're in the privileged position of being able to choose exactly who we work with, but obviously a lot of people end up working with people that they didn't choose to be on a team with. However, you still find
But that's
meaning
where
even in those
that's
communities.
part of life. I mean,
It is
I think
part
it's
of life, exactly.
part of life is learning to make the best of what you have. I mean, you think about the person born in a small village. You can't change who lives in your village.
You can't choose your family.
Yeah, you can't choose your family. I think it's so interesting when you think about it. And I think this relates a lot to this epidemic of loneliness that we kind of experience or hear about. So many people now, you move away from your family, you go to a big city or whatever, you're working hard, you get a job, maybe you live by yourself, maybe you live with people you don't know who are your roommates. And you kind of increasingly kind of think like, anthropological humans, the way we evolved, that's not how we're supposed to be.
We
right?
were much more tribal.
Yeah,
If those sort of if that data is
even
correct.
if you take just like a more old-fashioned culture,
You could look at
like
the Italian culture.
I was just about to say like a
Great
southern Italian sort of culture where like people live in places where like they are near their parents. Their parents are involved in raising the grandkids. People, they'll have a network that's with them for their whole life. And don't get me wrong, like I personally, I'm like, on the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, the world is also amazing. Let's explore. There's something in the middle where like we're a little lost, where you have all these people who will, go from wherever to New York, and it's like, on the one hand, I've seen all these amazing things, and on the other, I have no one to enjoy it with or do. I'm lacking that deep connection. It's a sad state of affairs. Like it's funny because you end up in a way yearning for like the kind of the uni period or the school period where you had these obvious communities.
University is amazing for that. That's the one thing I always think about, is the beauty of it was living and working alongside your friends in such close proximity, and you get that community feel in a way that you don't really see since, do you?
I think that's part of the reason people end up, not necessarily uni, but people in general end up, for uni graduates, going into grad schemes and stuff. They're searching for that sense of community maybe and guidance. And for some, it's also why people end up places like the military. Yeah.
Big part of it.
Yep.
So I think what we'll do next is we will explicitly lay out the pros and cons as we see it of working remote, working from home versus working in a typical office. We'll weigh those up and discuss them the way we normally do. But first, a quick ad break.
Yeah, let us, satisfy our capitalist overlords.
National Geographic presents.
What I'm asking you to do is dangerous. You need to take your time to think it through.
No, I don't. What do I do?
We can't save everyone. But if I don't try, I don't think I'll be able to live with myself.
What are we supposed to do?
Some stood by.
Anything. You have to.
She stood up.
There has to be a line.
Belle Powley is Meep Geese.
There has to be me for this to work.
A Small Light limited series premieres Monday, May 1st at 9. Stream on Hulu and Disney+.
Okay, welcome back, guys. Or if there was no ad, we never left. Continue. Pros and cons of working from home or remotely versus typically working in an office. Let me reel them off for you, and then we'll discuss them in much more detail. But the list is as follows. Working from home, the pros, it allows for increased flexibility, particularly families, if you've got kids or you're caring for people. Reduced commuting time and therefore reduced expenses. You save bills on traveling in. Improved work-life balance. This is one we will we'll dig into. We have opinions on that, I know. And access to a wider talent pool for employers, or as employees, access to a wider range of jobs, which we've mentioned already. These are very clear benefits. The cons, however, are as follows. Isolation, lack of social interaction. Big theme we've already touched on. Difficulty with communication and collaboration within your team and with colleagues. And I think that's another thing we've seen firsthand, is that it can exacerbate difficulties there. You miss out on training and the other benefits of just like the osmosis kind of learning that happens when you're in an environment with
water cooler chat, people have to say.
Yeah, exactly. A lack of structure and accountability. We mentioned already about, when people aren't directly monitoring you, you also maybe have a sense of, it's harder to be as organized, and potential for distractions. I think, to be fair, I think this cuts both ways. People often say the office is a distracting place, but then working from home can be distracting, especially when you've got family members, pets, and other things interrupting your work.
Or, maybe the work from home thing is less potential for distractions. It's more potential for temptations.
Yeah, true.
Right. When I'm in the office, I have no temptation to like, oh, I'll just do the dishes.
It's true. Whereas, yeah, it can be quite natural to break up your day with chores. Maybe it's worth saying there's a benefit of that, which is just like the one thing with working from home I've noticed is that it is kind of easier to keep your life in order when you do it.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
frees up
And
weekend time.
it's a genuine benefit. That's part of the reason we do 1 or 2 days a week. We offer people that. It is just like, hey, save the commute time, and you could, like, let's be real, you're going to use it to do your chores. You do chores in between things, right? It's a bit easier to do stuff.
So there's the list, and I think let's just kind of properly have the discussion the way that we normally do. We can start point by point, and we'll probably go off on tangents, but increased flexibility, we were literally just saying about that as we were kind of wrapping it up. I think it's a
100%.
clear one, and I think something I was going to say is it's funny when you get these big changes that actually seem to stick, because there were a lot of things about COVID that I hope, thankfully, have kind of gone away, and that's like, there are definitely some people I think that are still more sort of socially phobic than they were, and maybe more germ phobic, but largely I think it's something that it's faded into the past for me, whereas this working from home, working remote thing has really taken root and changed the way that we work and changed the way that we approach work. And I think in some respects it's changed the whole paradigm of work that we have. It's a huge social shift, and there's a possibility here that actually this could lead to a world with less work, but I don't think we're there yet. But you're seeing it's created this opportunity for like people talking about the 4-day work week and things like that.
I think, well, the other thing is, remember what we said earlier, people are like getting further from their families and stuff like that. Part of the reason is because people used to have to move to mega centers where their families wouldn't be for the work.
For work.
But then suddenly there's this flexibility where it's like, oh, either 100% of the time or just more frequently, more companies are like, yeah, if you go away for a week or two, that's fine, work from there. You can go and spend time with your parents or with your family in some way. You can go to those places where like the reason you would go less is because you had to go to the office every day. And so it does definitely increase that flexibility. It's also for a lot of people, it's like, I would love to live in X place. For my career, I have to live in New York or London or whatever, right? And so it introduces that flexibility where like suddenly you can live in that place you want to live full-time or temporarily without it necessarily meaning that like your career has to flounder.
Which is a really big thing. And we talked about meaning earlier, and you're absolutely right. Like, people do find meaning in a lot of areas of their life. Work is obviously not the only, not even necessarily the main one. Family is, I think, for most people, probably the biggest. So the fact that it creates this flexibility where you can spend more time with your family more easily, or even just sort of flex your work around family commitments. So picking up kids, things like that, which are, I mean, again, so personal bias, these aren't concerns that we have to worry about yet between us, but it's certainly something I'm aware of. It matters to people, so it's a big one.
So the reduced commuting time and expense, I mean, yes. The expense is plus and minus, because on the other hand, one thing we've seen recently is heating your own home. Like literally WeWork, one of their ads was recently saying like, we have heating. And it's actually true. You can save a ton of cash just by going to a heated co-working space or office rather than having to pay for that yourself. Likewise with AC. Like no one in the UK has AC in their houses, but most offices do. Expenses plus and minus.
The planet benefits, that's a big plus.
Again, heating. It's actually much more efficient to heat a shared space than it is for everyone to heat their homes.
The planet benefits in summer.
Well, AC. Well, actually, AC is only enough. The planet. I mean, expenses, planet benefits. It's all plus and minus. It depends a little bit.
It does.
Reduced commuting time is a objective yes.
Personal perspective, though, I quite like the commute. I like it as a sort of feature of like natural exercise in my day. I like it as something to kind of.
I think people underestimate if you
transition
don't
of like focus and relax.
I think people underestimate if you don't commute, like just how little activity you're doing during the day.
I don't know if people relate to this or not. And maybe this is just a feature of the fact that I very rarely work from home, but I find it really sort of like almost distorting when I finish working from home and then I'm just in my home.
Yeah,
do you know? You just close your laptop and it has this sort of weirdly unceremonious, like, that's the end of the day. Whereas when you pack up and you leave the office and you cycle home,
I found for me that's really helpful, particularly as someone running a company. But maybe you're someone who has the same problem. Like a really nice way to delineate like this is a work problem, so it's for tomorrow, is leaving the office.
Yeah.
If you leave the office in your home and you get a ping on Slack or LinkedIn or whatever, often I'll check it still. But like, I do also, if I've had a long day, I feel the right to be like, no, I'm home. It's time to rest. Unless someone like WhatsApps me like, hey, it's urgent.
We have a friend called Andy. I remember chatting to him about this because he's a keen cyclist and so therefore he always used to cycle. And I think he still does.
Likewise, I'm a cyclist. I like my commute because I cycle every day.
And he sort of talks about the
I'm not a cyclist. I just cycle to work.
He had a really nice expression. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was to the effect of like, when you cycle, you can kind of relax and your subconscious kind of processes a lot of stuff, and it just becomes this weirdly like meditative time to just kind of process your day.
I think it's funny. I think a lot of people kind of approach meditation with this kind of woo-woo, kind of like, no, you have to be like in touch with your soul or whatever. No, the point of meditation is to be present, and exercise is a great way to be present.
Yeah.
Right? Because
I find it probably the
exactly.
most meditative part of my
Yeah.
routine, to be honest.
You're focusing on how your body feels, often because it's negative in the moment, but still, it's like, oh, my legs hurt, or it's difficult. But like, you're cycling, you have to focus on where you're going and stuff. It's a really great way to kind of relax.
You create space for your brain to
Yep.
just kind of do its thing. And
Yeah.
and I find it's actually a nice time to solve problems as well, because
Yeah.
you're not necessarily deliberately consciously thinking about stuff, but it just happens.
Yeah.
Maybe the fact that our commute is exercise based is separate from like if you're taking the train, if you're
And
driving.
if you're taking a horribly packed train, I can understand that. But then on the flip side, work from home is one solution to that. Another solution is sort your life around having a better commute. Again, certain amount of privilege there. Like, I think a lot of people have those awful commutes for financial reasons, not because they're making bad choices.
Let's talk about work-life balance, because one thing I remember we said years and years ago when we wrote our like cultural mission for running Stasher was that we were like, we don't like the phrase work-life balance because we think work should be a positive part of your life. And at least when you work with us, that's how we want it to come across. We don't want life to have to balance out working.
Yeah, that sounds
at our
sounds
company.
like the kind of thing that, someone would say in a sinister way. Like, so you have to work, but like, bear in mind, we work from like 10 till 6. We take like a lunch all together. We chill and chat. Like, we genuinely mean like we're not pushing people on that.
Yeah, it's not a cover for sort of like a banking culture. It is just that like a well-designed place of work shouldn't feel like a sort of counterbalance to life in a negative way.
I think, there's this kind of, it's a very kind of capitalist perspective where, like a lot of people are comfortable doing work they hate. And it's like, well, yes, but it earns me money and I can do stuff with my free time. And it's like, well, it's not work time and free time. It's all time. Right. And if you feel like half of it sucks, you're probably spending your time quite badly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but no amount of quote unquote life could make me happy with wasting or feeling like I'm wasting 60 hours a week. Here's the classic example. Would you ever take a job where you had to sit in a room and do nothing 8 hours a day, but you were paid £1 million a year?
That's a nice thought experiment.
Yeah.
And how strict is the doing nothing? Because
you're not allowed to amuse yourself.
Oh Jesus!
It has to be actively unpleasant.
Wow. Okay. I mean,
and then if you start getting good at meditating or whatever, then we'll find you an annoying task to do. Like, we'll literally get you to just like write out the dictionary every day, and then we'll shred it at the end of the day.
Oof.
And if you don't hit a certain amount, we're like, you haven't been working hard enough.
God, that's so myth of Sisyphus, isn't it?
It is.
That's an interesting thought experiment, because I suppose it just depends where you draw the line. $1 million is a tempting amount of money, but
to write out the dictionary every day. Would you really consider
and then
it?
get it shredded in front of my face?
in front of you. How much of a difference would it make if you could see it stacking up over time, or if we shredded the paper every day?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it would make a big difference. Weirdly, it wouldn't matter either way.
You'd sort of feel like you're making progress, and it was all for nothing. I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment. I'd love to.
Yeah.
Hear what
Well,
people
the
think
sad
about
thing
that.
is that's how a lot of people see their work. Another one. And this is so embedded that it's like I think I've said this before, it's a prompt on Hinge. Like, how do you deal with the Sunday scaries? And it's like, my feeling is like, man, if you feel like nervous about work every Sunday, that is a really good nudge that you're doing something wrong with your life. Right. And so likewise, to use the office analogy, if you wake up like, oh, I have to go to the office tomorrow, maybe that's more of a nudge that you should make some changes in your life than going to the office is terrible.
Interesting. Yeah.
Maybe that specific office is terrible, but like maybe the changes you need to make are like, find an office that doesn't make you feel that way. Find a job either because of the nature of the job or the day-to-day of that job, or the people you're working with make you not like, oh, I have to go in.
You have to see them again.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, and I think again, I feel very privileged that it's something I don't generally get, or it's something I wasn't even really aware of as a concept until chatting to friends. Because I think we're very fortunate that I tend to be quite excited about work, and maybe that's more unusual than I appreciate.
Loser.
But yeah,
and don't get me wrong, everything's shades, right? Like, I'm not saying everyone has to wake up overjoyed about work every day, or else like, make changes. And obviously, making changes can be a difficult process too.
Yeah, well, even our work has ups and downs, right? Because you have the pros and cons.
COVID,
of biggest down ever.
But yeah, exactly. Like, I'm not saying take it with a pinch of salt. People generally understand. But from the employer side, something that we didn't mention so much is if we're hiring remote, just aside from the fact that you're looking at cheaper geographies, if we do plus or minus 5 hours either side of the UK, you've suddenly increased your hiring pool from 60. Actually, we're talking about London. You've increased your hiring pool from, and this isn't even factoring by how many are developers or whatever,
a few million
to hundreds of millions. Yeah. Like, you just have a way, way larger number of people who are suddenly eligible for the job, which makes it much more likely that you'll find someone.
That's probably the plus that stands out most to me about doing this, and it's the biggest reason I think we have deliberately embraced it, is because it benefits.
Yeah. Not to mention, like we said above, the purchasing power parity thing. It means that it can be a win on both sides. Actually, I'll tell you what, one that we should discuss, and it can maybe be even a separate episode, should there be cost of living pay adjustments?
Yeah,
It kind of comes to the tasks versus time thing. We'll come back to that.
I've noticed it's something people market quite strongly. But yeah, it's interesting. Just to quickly sum up the pros looking through them, my feeling is really, I totally see the benefits of flexibility. I kind of get the commuting point. Improved work-life balance is a sort of bit meh for me. Talent pool is a big one, but I think maybe it's a product of personal circumstance. Talent pool is the only one that really resonates. And I feel like the flexibility could be beneficial in the future. And there's maybe some degree to which I benefit from that without really appreciating it. But
Wait, how so? Sorry.
just because that's kind of the nature that the way that we always work is that, you know, sometimes you work on weekends or evenings, and that allows you to like sort of set your time to exercise in the morning and then come in you know, there's flexibility in
Wait, is that the work-life balance or flexibility?
I'm talking about flexibility. I'm just saying working remotely or from home. Even this morning, for example, I was working from home because it allowed me just to like organize my life a little bit and then come in. And it's not
So
something
you're
that-
saying you weren't working during working hours.
but this is my point, is that we do that anyway as founders because we'll work weekends and you sort of
Got you.
you end up putting in more than the time just because you're passionate. But summarizing those, I resonate a lot with the talent pool one. That's, to be honest, the main thing that keeps
You're
me
such an
interested.
employer.
I am, and I'm totally biased by that. But
Yeah.
I can see why other
I
people benefit more from it.
personally really like. I've made my point on the commuting time one. I get it, and it's true. But like I said, at the expenses one, it's like pluses and minuses. So it depends so much on your personal circumstances. Like we said, if you're work from home and you could cycle, you're probably spending more because of heating your home. But yeah, the commuting time, again, like you can get a little bit stuck, but that can also be around like some decisions you're making. And then the work-life balance one, yeah, I think the note here says, remote work can allow individuals to better balance their work and personal lives, which can lead to reduced stress and improve overall well-being, which is just another way of saying like, you spend less time having to go to a job that really, really stresses you out.
Yeah. Another flexibility one that we haven't talked about, but you and I have slightly different opinions on, is the flexibility of like remote work. It functions in two ways, because there's remote work when you're based permanently abroad, and then there's remote work where you basically work from holiday.
Yes, this is a difficult one because we've seen this with our own, like, I think one of the main things is basically like, do you settle? Do you know what I mean? I don't know. It's very difficult, the kind of the pleasure versus working remote temporarily, right?
Yeah, and it's one I'm quite cynical about without wanting to sound too harsh, but it does feel like you kind of, for me, I feel like you get the worst of both worlds when you're working from holiday, because you're not properly on holiday.
And you're not properly working.
You're also not necessarily properly working, but I can see why there's a temptation, because it sort of means you can extend time away, even if that means you're sort of like paying more costs for being abroad. But then I'm kind of like, you've paid to be somewhere nice, but then you're just sitting on your laptop all day. That said, you know, if you go somewhere hot and you work the sort of unpleasant hours and then use the evenings to explore, like, I get it. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter where people are working. Is the point that all of this highlights. It doesn't matter where people are working as long as they're able to do effective work.
Well,
so
tasks, not time. We'll come to that.
Yeah, I think my cynicism comes in with the holiday part, is that like, if you don't invest in a proper setup, I think there's far more
That's
risk of not being able to work productively. And that's
so if you're not staying in one place long enough to really get to know what you're doing there, and you're not renting a place that has like an appropriate, really just decent Wi-Fi, table and chair in a quiet place.
we put this in our remote policy. We said these are the sort of minimum conditions. It's just like, take calls somewhere quiet, have good Wi-Fi, have a desk.
Yeah.
Like,
Which you'd be amazed. Like a lot of people, there's nothing worse than when you want to really talk to someone properly. It's annoying enough you're in a video call rather than in person. Yeah. And then, they'll dial in from like a loud cafe somewhere.
Right.
Where also, we've all worked in a cafe before. A lot of them are set up properly for it nowadays. So not all of them, but a lot of them, you're on a table that's not got enough space to really have a laptop, and, there's music playing and stuff like that. We've all done it before. You kind of realize like, oh, in a pinch it's okay, but that's not a way to work sustainably.
Yeah.
Cons. Have we gone through the cons?
So the cons were isolation.
That's it. We stepped on isolation, and then we kind of got we sidetracked by it.
I think it's a big one.
This is the one that
it's one that concerns me.
Yeah, this is the one I keep making the analogy with fast food. We have too much of a culture, really, of as things get more and more comfortable, and we kind of miss that comfortable isn't always better.
Suffering and struggle is growth, right?
Suffering and struggle is growth. Sometimes.
Paraphrase Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. Or not. I was going to say Viktor Frankl, but it's not quite right. Sometimes a little bit of difficulty can be a good thing. A little bit of boredom. A little bit of lack of comfort. It's the same reason people, for example, delete their social media. It's like, what am I going to do to fill my time? And it's like, well, you'll be forced to find something something useful or interesting, or whatever else. Like, this is a vacuum that's taking up your time, in the same way that, like, well, that's not exactly the same point, but the point is that, like, sometimes comfortable isn't better.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes it takes us a long time to realize comfortable isn't better.
It's what you're optimizing to. I'm inclined to agree. I think conflict and struggle is ultimately what makes you more resilient as a person and grow. And I think you can really optimize a life to comfort that is ultimately less challenging. It does come down to what you value and where you value finding meaning in your life, because there are people who've engineered extremely comfortable lives where they work limited hours, are paid well, live somewhere nice, and then
Yeah,
I
and they're
presume find meaning in other
and
areas.
yeah, maybe they're not isolated and lacking social interaction. Maybe they are.
That comes from their friendships.
Yeah,
and
they have friendships, or they have a partner, and they have kids, and they have people who live nearby. It's really more the people who basically there was a wave of people during the pandemic who were like, oh my God, I get to sit at home and do all my work. And it was like, really? Like getting to sit in your living room by yourself? How bad was your life before? That's a step up, like having to sit by yourself at home.
This is where, again, I'm wondering if it's personal for me as to why I find this a sort of strong concern. But if I'm to work from home, the same is true for you. We're literally on our own in bedroom or a living room, and that's it.
Yeah.
And
Granted, some people have roommates or whatever.
this is it. People do maybe have like their family around or roommates, or like there are work from home setups where actually you've got a bit of social interaction there. But for me, it would be zero social interaction, and therefore I'm like, why would I want to be here over being in the office? Where even if there's not that many people in the office, at least there are other companies and other people I can hang out with.
Yeah, that's it. It's just sometimes it's not even about interacting with them. It can be as simple as like bumping into someone when you're getting coffee.
Someone to go for lunch with, exactly.
That's it.
As opposed to just like stopping work, making pasta by myself, eating pasta by myself, returning to work.
Okay, big one, next one. Difficulty with communication and collaboration. I mean, the first thing I'm going to say is that like most of us know this. I don't know if we like. I feel like everyone has felt this, right? And some people kind of bring a perspective where they want something to be so true that they kind of fight this corner. Like people who were like remote first before COVID, like, no, it makes no difference. It's like, look, it's fine. Like it's doable, but like, let's not pretend it's not better than all being in the same room. Right?
Yeah.
It could be that it's not worth it because of the difficulty or the hiring or the costs of everyone being in London and stuff like that. But like, make those arguments. Don't pretend that like communicating via Zoom or Slack is better than talking in person.
Do you know what this really reminds me of? You know, the comedian Ramesh Ranganathan?
Yeah.
He's famously a vegan, and he says exactly the same thing. He's like, being vegan is great. It has all these benefits. It's good for the planet, this and that. You can feel morally superior, but let's not pretend the food is better.
Exactly. It's actually such a perfect example. It's actually so true. Where like vegans are like, this tastes just like meat. It's like, look, man, it doesn't. And that's okay. You can say this tastes acceptable. That's because we know that's what it means, right?
It's a perfect analogy because I think you're right. Humans naturally communicate most effectively in person.
That's it. You're just made for it. But then humans also naturally like get very staunchly behind whatever belief they already have and fight their corner and want what they want to be true.
So what matters is hitting like a threshold acceptable level of communication. And this is something I was thinking about obsessively in January. And so when we kind of came up with our communication policy, I distilled it down to like, these are the 3 benefits that being in an office together, I think summarizes what being in an office together is good for, what communicating in person is good for. And those are knowledge sharing, idea generation, and motivation. And to break those down a little bit more, knowledge sharing is basically when you're in a room with people, it's so easy to keep up to date with things because you
just hear people talking about it.
Even passively,
you're at lunch. It's like, oh, what are you up to at the moment? Oh, I'm doing that project. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
cool.
and you don't need to sort of make the effort to go on Slack and be like, hey, so-and-so, what are you working on? And it's more natural. It just happens more organically.
Exactly. People don't realize how much you keep up to date. Like the people who don't work in the office, so often someone will mention something and they're like, oh, before.
Yeah,
we'll come back to
this is the challenge.
Before, so many people would, you mentioned something, they'd be like, what's that? And they wouldn't even know this project has been worked on. It's like, oh, we just take for granted everyone in the office knows it's happening because we just talk about it, or someone will just shout across the room, what do you think about this?
And that links quite neatly to the second one, which is idea generation, which is that, again, when you're chatting to people at water cooler, lunch table, whatever, ideas get sparked more easily. We find this all the time when you and I work together. It's just like, we'll kind of decide on things, but then when we're actually chatting together, like even on the way to this podcast, we were talking about a particular tech problem that we're working on.
We're like, what about doing this way?
What about doing it this way? And I was initially like, skeptical. But then as we were talking and walking, I was like, I see the point you're making. I can come around to this view. And it's so much easier having that talk in person than over Slack, because over Slack, it's a bit more easy to misread tone or anything else.
Well, that's a fourth one you didn't mention, but we'll come back to. Another thing with the idea generation, which is the opposite of idea generation, but idea killing.
So it's just decision making to some extent, isn't it?
Well, sometimes, say you're in the same room with someone, and we've had this, for example, with Yara, who runs our operations sometimes, or sometimes the other way around with like tech people, right? Or sometimes we don't get it with tech people because they're not in the office as much. But sometimes Meg will chime in for the tech people. Hi, Yara, Meg, if you're listening.
Hey guys.
Sometimes people will be saying, people will be like, oh, we're thinking this, or we're going to do this, right? And then someone overhears it and says, oh, no, wait. You're missing this perspective you're missing this perspective from my team, and actually it means that that's a terrible idea, right? And unless it was being talked about out loud and someone overheard it, that team doesn't sometimes give that input until it's too late. I actually remember a very specific example of this, the review thing with Luke, right? And it was only talked about on Slack, and then Luke implemented something. Luke's a developer, implemented something, and then it came out and it was like, oh, this isn't what we meant. And part of that is like, oh, you need to communicate clearly. But part of that is that like, if we were together in a room, that miscommunication wouldn't have happened, or someone else would have picked up on it and be like, no, that's not solving the problem. This is the way. Like an operations person or a marketing person would have heard and be like, no, you're thinking about the problem the wrong way.
100%. And then the final point that I had written in the policy was motivation, because I think in the same way we're talking about the sort of community benefits of working together, there is that real sense of like, let's give an example. When someone closes a nice deal, they make a sale, whatever, you can be like, hey, nice job. Or like there's that sort of sense of celebration. And something we've done to artificially create that is we have a celebrations channel on our Slack.
And we encourage particularly managers to put things in.
So people can say, hey, someone's done a great piece of work, and then everyone else can do a little fire emoji, to-dar emoji, all this stuff. It's artificial compared to that sense of like...
Even then, you can't forget we're monkey brains, monkey bodies. Like, it is literally a hormonal response to being in the same room with people and someone saying, oh, good job, and other people going, yeah. Like,
you get that dopamine hit that's just like...
It doesn't compare with
it's dulled down when someone... I love it when we post something and I'll be like, hey, so-and-so did a great piece of work, and you can see everyone else get excited by it. And it's nice to be able to share that information with everyone efficiently. And actually, to flip all this, one real benefit of Slack communication versus being in an office and just talking about stuff is that stuff is well documented. And that's, I think,
that's actually
that's the sort of benefit that I've been trying to lean
knows.
into.
Yeah, we'll come to like how we try to solve the problems. Oh, the fourth one that you didn't mention, tone. Or like non-written.
Yeah.
You need to be much, much more careful. Well, that's one. And then two, everyone is more reasonable in person, right? Like, people will write very angry messages and be very chill on a video call, and then even more chill in person, right? It's a great mediator. And actually, as a general rule, I would say, like, on a scale of like emotional intensity to like in real life, the more emotionally intense or important something is, the more in real life that discussion should be with someone. So like, as an example, to give a super trivial one, you should never fire someone over an email, right? You probably shouldn't even fire them over a video call unless they're like really far away. Like,
it's preferable not to give notice over an email too.
Yeah. Take like a personal example. Like, it applies to your personal life too, by the way. If you're fighting with a partner, do not fight over text. Ideally, don't even fight over the phone. Fight in person. You'll be amazed how much it tones everything down.
But it's true. It's true.
And it's natural, because like we respond, we hate to upset other people. And it's much easier to not realize how hurtful you're being. And it's also much easier to like not understand tone and stuff.
I always find it fascinating because the one thing about texting arguments is just that everything has a permanent record. So when you're texting and you're being really horrible, or you have the temptation to be horrible, it's there forever. But that doesn't seem to work as a deterrent.
People
in the way
don't
expect.
scroll back and check though.
Maybe that's it. It's fascinating, particularly like public forums online. People are really like vicious, but you'd think that deterrent would sustain, and it doesn't really. Whereas the deterrent of you say something upsetting someone's face and then they look upset, that does so much more to like
so much more. Like the
measure
prospect
of
calling someone an idiot over a message versus saying it to their face.
Yeah.
Like, it's so much harder to do to someone's face.
It's madness, isn't it?
And that's we could all be trained to be worse people if we just... So the third point we have here in the cons is training and benefits of learning. Is that a little bit overlapping with communication, i.e. it's easier to train people when you can communicate well?
Yeah, I suppose it is. It's specifically, though, it relates to the age-based disparity that we're seeing, where older people tend to have a preference to work from home. Younger people, I think, naturally, in general, I think it's healthier when younger people have more of a motive to be in the office, because at least you get the benefits of learning from more experienced people. And I think that's a real problem in today's sudden shift, right?
Yeah. And I think a big part of it as well is that like a lot of people underestimate just the extent to which you learn by seeing other people doing.
Yeah.
And so like, to give a trivial example, overhearing someone taking a call and just understanding like the way they deal with objections or the tone they use or how they, I don't know, how long they even talk on the call, right? All of that is so much easier in person. And then any immediate questions you can ask immediately afterwards. I mean, I guess someone could record their call and send you their recorded calls. All of this stuff, there are some substitutes, but they're not quite the same in all cases. But yeah, and it also takes much, much, much more effort rather than you just being there. Think about all the things you'd have to think about and categorize and record and put in a file and share with someone versus you just seeing it and picking it up over time by seeing them. The funny thing is, and I think a lot of people who work at big companies will realize, there's a lot of stuff that's not codified. One of the things you might learn from a manager in real terms is like, how do you play office politics?
Yeah, how do you behave around certain people?
Or exactly. Or like, no one's going to message you on Slack like, by the way, this guy's a bit of a dick. The way you get them to do what you want is this, right? Whereas that is the kind of
thing. Guys, don't tell Ant that that's
Whereas you might maybe explicitly in person where it's a bit safer, you wouldn't do it in writing. Or maybe implicitly pick that up in the office.
I think that's a really, really valid point. You just learn how to behave around people, and you also learn more about their communication style. So it's easier to do it remote when you have done it in person.
And I mean, like, you can think about someone like PwC, right? They're going to tell you how you get your promotion, and then your manager, or just watching your manager or watching other people, is how you learn how you actually get your promotion.
And one thing that links from that, without putting too fine a point on the sort of drinking culture of different offices, is that being at the pub with people afterwards and building that sort of rapport and friendship.
Yeah, 100%. This is a really interesting point. Again, could be a whole separate episode. A lot of people will be like, that's unfair. Why are we prioritizing people just because you like them or whatever? Like, wait, let's flip this around. Like, why does anyone run a business, right? And it's like, oh, well, I don't know, to make money or whatever. And it's like, well, why does anyone make money? To be happy, right? I mean, one thing that we kind of consciously say sometimes is that we think about like the thing that we're trying to do is be happy. And don't get me wrong, making a ton of profit is like nice way of doing it. Making a lot of money is a part of doing that. But like, there are limits. Like, I understand the trade-offs I'm making. Like, hey, if I thought working 150 hours, or that's not a good example. I don't know. There are some things that you kind of realize like, well, you know, that's not a trade-off I'm willing to make, even though I think it might maybe help us make a bit of money. Like, in the mid to long term, it's a bad trade-off because I won't want to stick around because it would be just so horrible. I'm not saying this as like a pro for drinking culture, but I am saying it as a pro for like working with people you want to work with. Like, sometimes people are like, oh, that's unfair, as if like everything should be this kind of sterile, neutral, like transactional. And it's like, actually, you know what? Maybe favoring someone because people enjoy working with them is actually a totally legitimate basis.
It just makes sense because it's about improving your own communication with that person. And we've said before in the context of like partnerships and deals rather than in the context of employment, but people do business with people they like.
That's it.
It's a natural thing, I think.
And this is, again, it's like utilitarianism. It's really about the time horizon over which you're optimizing, right? Because I think part of this is that if you optimize over the right time horizon, actually picking the person who is a quote unquote, you know, not necessarily better worker, but people get on with, will probably lead to better results in the mid to long term, because people will actually like better retention. People want to stick around, better communication, and general morale.
It's the same way. I mean, in sports, like sports locker rooms or the changing room in football, you have characters who they're not necessarily the best players on the pitch.
That's it. The most important player isn't necessarily the best player.
Yeah, they stick in teams and they get retained because they just add that sort of cultural value. There's something we're conscious of as employers, and I want to make sure I phrase this correctly, but we definitely see value in the kind of people who they'll hang around after work because we're doing a social
I get what you mean. I don't want to
phrase that incorrectly.
I don't want to phrase it that way because, for example, there are lots of remote workers that we have who are like really positive cultural members of the team.
Absolutely.
But I get what you mean. It's hard to like,
it's knowing when to show face and invest, really.
Exactly.
Seeing that willingness from team members is a powerful signal that they value being part of the team and you want to work with them and they're prepared to invest in that relationship.
It can be stuff like making the effort to make sure you go to team calls. It can be, you know what, again, it's one of those things where I don't want to codify because the whole point is that this shouldn't be codified. It's just human interaction. It's having a quip on the Slack that like shows that you're actually like trying to relate with someone as a human and are interested in what they are showing and stuff, right? Like it's being the person who bothers, you know, being the first one to put a fire emoji on someone's celebration and saying, hey, that's really great. I remember you talking about this earlier.
It's those positive, like really humanizing interactions. It's a nice way of putting it is that it is about sort of humanity, because I think something that we've always really appreciated about running our own company is that you don't have the sort of stuffy cultural norms of a big company where professionalism comes first and you have to be, you know, you have to wear suits and it's all very formal. Like we've always deliberately run things in a more casual way than that. And
part of that's because the point is to be happy.
Exactly. And creating the space for those sort of human interactions. And we've gone off a bit of a tangent here, but I think it's an important one, is that when people do get to spend social time together around work, you build these good relationships that ultimately allow you to work better.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. It's so funny because there is that argument like, oh, like, you know, pub culture, etc. I mean, like, there's no requirement to drink, for example. And it is annoying because I get like, oh, it's unfair, for example, working parents. But like, it's one of those ones where it's like, I don't know what you want us to say. Like, no one else is allowed to be friends so that you're all on an even footing. Like, because like we said at the beginning, like ultimately people who get on probably are going to work better together. And that's actually a midterm gain if you're going to turn it into a strict like revenue argument. The other thing is like, what's the whole point is to be happy.
It doesn't need to be necessarily drinking related.
Exactly.
Is a really
turn up and don't drink, or do things that don't involve drinking.
It's about turning up. It's showing that investment in the relationship both ways.
Fair,
and it's something we have to be conscious of too. We have to make sure we create the opportunity to invest in.
That's true.
In that relationship.
I'm also conscious there's some people like to keep personal and work a little separate. So like I get like there are lots of people who like can still bring that attitude and not necessarily join for like quote unquote extracurriculars. It's not a requirement like at all, but there's still people who bring that attitude to the way they deal with other people. I mean, for example, join for communal lunch. That we all eat lunch together at lunch. Like, come and engage, talk.
I understand people wanting to have that separation. I think maybe the bias that we have then is just that, like, in the kind of team that we want to run, I think particularly this is important in small companies. If you want that distance, you probably should be in a bigger company.
Yeah, probably. Actually, another point on this, you know, we should have made it early in the beginning. I think one thing that's really important is that with all of these things, there is no right answer, and it's a marketplace, right? So people can do whatever they want. And the market will kind of sort it out. If you are too strict on coming to the office and no one wants to come into the office, either you will have to pay an exorbitant extra to hire people. And it's like, well, you choose whether you want to pay that, or you'll have to change your policy. And the pricing mechanism, i.e., market rate salaries is what does that naturally. And lots of people should do differently. So for example, I'm saying a lot of people complaining, oh, Elon Musk, as if like he's objectively wrong. It's like, hey, look, if Elon wants to run Twitter, like requiring that people come to work, there's some number of people who love that. And as long as that number of people is enough for him to fill his hiring slots, what's it matter? Like if you don't like it, don't apply to Twitter.
It's
fine.
exactly his prerogative. It's the same way that when you're sort of setting up dating profiles, it's actually better to be more authentic than sort of potentially narrow your pool, but filter
there was
your
a
pool.
there was an executive who greenlighted The Simpsons,
Mhm.
and like there was something before where they used to look at the ratings of shows on pilots or whatever and be like, oh, is it at least 70%? Yeah, sure, put it live. And he was like, no, I don't want to see that. The top 10% of people who liked it, what was their average rating, right? And he was like, it's much more important that some people love it
Yeah.
then everyone kind of likes it. It's the same with jobs, right? Like there is all options are totally fine, from all the way remote to all like every day in office and I expect you to work 100 hours. Just be clear, communicate it, and you'll find the people for whom that works. And if that doesn't work, then you'll have to change a little bit to the market.
We're adapting to that now, I think, because that's like the fact that there's still sort of judgment and discussion and backlash about the way that people are doing this, and Elon Musk is a great example. It shows that the market is kind of adapting to the fact that these discrepancies exist. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we'll get to a stage where companies basically just advertise honestly the way that they want to work, and people make decisions based on that. And I don't think there's
and
really...
then depending on what makes sense for people, the relative salaries, like my high level take on the whole, like, should you pay cost of living adjustments? My high level take is pay what the job is worth, and if someone wants to live somewhere expensive but really wants that job,
They'll take it.
they can decide to make that trade off. And if not, like, well, effectively that company might basically only be hiring remote somewhere cheap, and that's the decision they made by setting that price.
Nice.
Because otherwise it would be a bit like saying, oh, this is the salary range for this job, unless you're really good. Right? Like, it's like, well, no, this is what we're offering, and if we don't find the right candidate, then we'll change it. But yeah, sorry. So we talked through a lot of the rest. Lack of structure and accountability. I think again, this one might
Kind of
be
links to
little,
communication.
it relates again to communication, because you can make structure very explicit. But then there's also implicit structure, like implicit, like, you know, how strict is your hierarchy? Like, how much can you push back on things, etc.
It's definitely one that I feel like I've struggled to get right. It's something I'm kind of constantly trying to manage better, because I think when you're in an office, there is a natural, easy structure, and the accountability comes from literally being present in a room. So you can see when someone's working. To be fair, there's always the fact that, like, you can't, unless you're literally looking at people's screens,
You don't know
unless
what
they're
people are
really
doing,
quick at
exactly.
changing tabs, you can't tell how much time they're actually wasting.
Yeah. To flip it around, like maybe people don't work every hour, but like I don't think if people can work effectively every hour anyway. People get coffees and whatever, and they should. Like,
Yeah.
you can't work 8 hours hard work effectively. So maybe that's not a problem, and maybe that's more a hangover presenteeism, right? So
Yeah,
should we-
presenteeism is definitely a problem. I think where structure becomes important is just the opposite of like zero structure is as bad as the case of like total presenteeism. And I think finding that balance is probably a case by case thing, person by person, and it's tricky.
I want to talk really quickly about one last thing. One cultural value that we try to implement. Oh, we never talked about one, how we do open communication. So another thing we do is we get everyone to post just a daily update, what they're up to. Just something really brief. And we make really clear to people, this is not to monitor how much work you're doing. You can write a single line. I personally myself do this all the time. Just put a couple things. Doesn't need to be
The
literally
high level stuff that's valuable for people to see.
Exactly. And the point is just that it's that equivalent of the person shouting across the room and you being like, oh, that's relevant to me. I'll comment on that. Right.
Yeah.
Or oh, I'm just aware that project is going on. Right.
Mhm.
It's not at all a measure of how much people are doing. We didn't mention that policy. One thing that we tried to implement, but I want to talk about the difficulties, is this concept of tasks, not time. So this is again, like, you can kind of say like, look, this is the output we want, and I don't care how long it takes you to do it. Right. The only problem with that is, with the exception of a few roles, and the most obvious one is sales, it's really, really hard sometimes to, one, associate certain tasks to tangible output for the company. The sales doesn't have that problem. You know, you basically it assumes it's easy to measure every task, which it isn't. And it assumes it's easy to measure the output or value of every task, which it isn't either, right? So then a tasks, not time framework, tons of sense for sales. How does it work for your HR person? How much should you expect your HR person to complete in a day?
It's really tricky, isn't it?
How
This
much
is
a
almost-
marketing person, right? Like sometimes you kind of get people like, oh, well, PPC, but like how much is that happening just because you've set it all up already, right? Like how do I estimate how much value you should be adding in, or how much improvement I should see over X period?
Yeah, we could almost spin this out into its whole thing, because it is hard, because on the one hand, it's way more efficient if you can structure contracts so that you pay for results.
That's perfect alignment. The
it's
problem
perfect
is
alignment.
the problem is you can't measure
Yeah.
perfectly.
Probably part of the reason, even though it's ultimately just a hangover from like factory lines, the reason that we have sort of time-based contracting is just because at least you can control the amount of effort people put in, which you can't now in this sort of work remote environment in the same way. Sub like monitoring people's green dots, and even then there's plugins for
Yeah, no, which is pointless to do.
that.
And also, like, no one wants to work in that environment anyway, so it'd be a net loss for yourself in the midterm anyway.
I find it fascinating. 'cause
I think it's no coincidence that sales as a function was much more used to being remote and contract before COVID than most other functions. And it's for this exact reason. It's so easy to measure the output of sales. And the thing is, ultimately, like, it's money in, money out, right? Like, no employer in their right mind chooses the salesperson who works 80 hours a week to return half the value to the salesperson who works 2 minutes a day, but, returns 3 times the value, right? Like, no one in their right mind picks the first person because they're working more hours.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's because it's measurable. The problem is, when you're talking about marketing, it's so much harder to measure. It's like, how do I know they're doing the right stuff in the 2 minutes? And so time becomes a corollary.
Exactly. And it's tricky because I think one of my personal sort of values and beliefs is just like, you get out of things what you put in, and therefore it's really valuable to kind of structure it so that people are putting in effort. However, exactly like you're saying, we've totally changed the way of working, and all the structures and things that you inherit from the past were geared around office-based work. So a lot of the practices that work well in offices, you now have to adapt to a remote environment. I think honestly, we're just in a position where we're still trying to figure out what exactly looks good for that, because as much as you'd love it to be a case of like, hey, I'm just paying for this output, if it takes you 5 minutes and then you've got the rest of the day off, great, you gave me the output I was paying for. That works as an ideal, but then in practice it's like, well, you want to peg it to effort because you also want people to be committed in a way that, they're getting stuff out of it because they're putting stuff into it. It's hard, man.
It's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Anywho, yeah, good
session.
discussion.
We don't have time to do the follow-up session, so we'll film that. We're going to do the next one on strikes in France.
Thank you for listening, guys. And as always, send us your thoughts. Tell us if you disagree or agree with stuff, or if anything changed your perspective in a way that you hadn't thought of it, or if you think we're totally wrong.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, the thing is, ultimately, if you think we're totally wrong, it doesn't matter because it's a marketplace. Like, yeah, to some people, we probably are totally wrong. To some people, we might be spot on. As long as we can hire enough people to do what we need, it's okay.
Yeah. But as always, please leave us a review, particularly if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts. That's where we could really do with a little bit more love. But no, thank you as always for listening. And do share this with friends. If you have this discussion, let us know your outcomes.
Speak soon.
We'll be back soon with more episodes on definitely AI and possibly strikes in France and the pension time bomb, and anything else that you care to suggest. Let us know, because we'll start recording more hot takes. Adios.